Hello and welcome. Let's have a talk about collisions in Godot and let's see them in detail. First, before we continue, I would like to take some time introducing you to the collision layers. You can find them inside your project settings under General and then the 2D physics. These layers are being reflected on the nodes that use a collision system of Godot. Each layer has a number and represents a different layer. You can name your layers inside the settings, or you can simply right-click on a number and rename it. I highly recommend that you name your used layers in order to keep things organized for your project. Going further, I added some visual colors to some of the collision layers, as you might see here. The reason why I did so is to give you an idea how the layers work. If you look at this, you will see that collision layers can be utilized in different ways. You may have a permanent, a temporary, or no collision at all. I probably missed some other use cases, but this is to give you an idea about the layers colliding. Let's have a look at a simple example. Imagine that we will have a very simplistic 2D platform setup. As a test case, we would have the collision layer set up for a player, an NPC, the world itself, and a box. If we separate the collision layers from the sprites, we'll get something like this. And if we bring them together, we'll have a visual ID of our collision layers. But even when these layers are put in place, it doesn't mean that they collide all the time with each other. It requires a specific setup to make it work. We'll get into the details right now. To continue, we'll be using two different collision layers. In here, you see a visual representation of those collision layers. Layer 1 is blue, while layer 2 is red. Take notice of the layer section and the mask section inside the collision menu. While they both use the collision layers, they do have a different usage. The layer section is to define in which layer or layers the node or the scene will be in, and the mask section is to define with which layer or layers it can collide. Also important to know is that, as mentioned before, the collision layers are shared. Take the Raycast2D node as an example. You also need to define which layer to use in order to collide with. But we're not going to go into details right now, for this at least. Let's move on and start introducing our node. As we want to use Godot's collision system, we'll need to define a node that works with it. As shown here, we have a certain amount of nodes we could work with. For the sake of keeping things simple, we'll call our node collision nodes, which can be any of the shown nodes. This collision node will refer as a node that works with our collisions. Of course, when working with these, we'll also make use of a collision shape to determine what the point of collision is. We'll also give our layers a name to make it a bit easier for us to understand. Layer 1 will be the player layer, while layer 2 will be the enemy layer. With this setup, we can prepare two different scenes. The first scene that we'll work with is a character. This character will have a collision node and is in the player layer. Next up, we'll also provide an NPC scene. This NPC will receive layer 2, so this is the enemy layer. Great, we have two scenes now that we have a collision node with two different layers. Important to notice here is that the collision layer for both mask sections are also set. The character is in the player layer and will collide with any enemy layer, while the NPC is in the enemy layer and will collide with any player layer. As we see them collide, a place of impact will occur. From this point of impact, we will have a collision. Remember that this is handled by our collision nodes. The collision finds place for both scenes because we explicitly configured it to do so. We can act upon these collisions and have the character deal damage to the NPC and have the NPC deal damage to the player. Of course, this requires us to write different scripts for it. For all collisions that happen, we'll need to write our own custom logic. Aside from this, we can also have a different setup. And there are many more, but let's zoom into this one. We could also remove collision detection for our NPC scene. So for this, the NPC is defined as an enemy but does not collide with any other layer. When another collision happens between the character and the NPC, only the character will detect the collision. So this means that only the character will deal damage because we scripted so, and the NPC does nothing. Even if you would script that the player should take damage from the NPC in this case, it won't happen. This because we did not define the player collision layer in the mask. And this is, in a nutshell, how collisions work within Godot. There are many ways to put this to use, so I really recommend to also have a look at the official Godot documentation. And last but not least, here are some tips that you might want to consider when working with collisions. It includes a summary of what was told before and some extras. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if so, keep an eye out for the next one, in which we'll turn this into practice. See you soon!